Welcome to the Instituto Fe y Libertad podcast. Today we are honored to interview Phillip Magness, a well-known economic historian and public policy analyst who can talk authoritatively about critical race theory, which is a timely and very controversial topic. Dr. Magness is Senior Research Faculty and Interim Research and Education Director at American Institute for Economic Research. He is also a research fellow at the Independent Institute. He holds a PhD and MPP from George Mason University School of Public Policy and a BA from the University of St. Thomas. Prior to joining AIER, Dr. Magness spent over a decade teaching public policy, economics, and international trade at institutions including American University, George Mason University, and Berry College. Magness's work encompasses the economic history of the United States and the Atlantic world, with specializations in the economic dimensions of slavery and racial discrimination, the history of taxation, and measurements of economic inequality over time. He also maintains active research interest in higher education policy and the history of economic thought. In addition to his scholarship, Magness's popular writings have appeared in numerous venues, including the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Newsweek, Politico, Recent, National Review, and the Chronicle for Higher Education. So thanks so much for being with us, Phillip.
Thanks for having me.
In a 1986 radio address, Ronald Reagan quoted Martin Luther King. And Reagan said, "We are committed to a society in which all men and women have equal opportunities to succeed. And so we oppose the use of quotas. We want a colorblind society. A society that, in the words of Dr. King, judges people not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." Now it seems that people are conceiving their identities exclusively on the basis of color. And I wanted to start off by asking you, do we construct our identity? And what role should race play in our personal identity?
Right. Well, this has been an interesting development in the study of race and the study of discrimination, which are absolutely real problems in society, and deep problems historically. And yet, at the same time, the way that we approach those problems has very strong determinative outcomes on the policy solutions that are offered. And, as the Reagan quote indicates, it had been the trend of things to combat discrimination by seeking colorblindness, seeking neutrality as a standard, to repudiate segregation, to repudiate Jim Crow, repudiate all these historical prejudices and wrongs. The entire notion was that by injecting race and skin color into your identity, you were treating people differently. And colorblindness was a way to escape that. Well, what critical race theory has done is they've completely flipped it on its head, and now they're asserting that race is a core function of a person's identity as an individual, and therefore needs to be taken into consideration, not as something discriminated against, but as something to be elevated to the forefront of determining whether someone has access to a certain policy or not. So it's almost a form of a positive spin on discrimination, that if you are of a certain previously discriminated against race, you should have access to more resources and more power and certain privileges in society that were previously denied by past regimes.
So what is critical race theory?
Well, that's the fun one, because whenever people are asked to define critical race theory that are supporters of it, they often quickly turn into what I call word salad. They speak in vague platitudes. They don't have a clear, coherent definition of what it even means. They'll drop statements that are very innocuous sounding on that we want to combat racism and discrimination, but then they'll also import a bunch of political baggage. I approach this as an outsider from the critical race theory tradition, and the definition I would give is critical race theory is an application of a school of philosophy known as critical theory to the concept of race. So the question is, what is critical theory itself? And this is an older approach to philosophical traditions that came out of the 1930s, a group of Western Marxist academics at the University of Frankfurt. They refer to them as the Frankfurt School. This is Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer are the two of the big founding figures of this. And Horkheimer writes an essay in the 1930s where he contrasts critical theories versus traditional theories of philosophy. And a traditional theory is something that's seen as descriptive, but it presents itself in a way that is strictly observational. And Horkheimer's critique of a traditional theory is it's propping up the powers that are already in place. It's propping up the inequities of society. And he says a critical theory is one that seeks to tear down those inequities and advocate in an emancipatory way. But he's a Marxist, so he means emancipatory. It means uplifting the proletariat classes. So the original critical theory is done on class lines. And this is part of where he gets the term, because Karl Marx's Das Kapital is his magnum opus. What's the subtitle of it? It's a critique of political economy. It's a form of critical theory. And he cites some others. Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason is an earlier version. It's a non-Marxist track. It precedes Marx. But he's drawing on this, and he's trying to separate critical from traditional theories, and he's an advocate of critical theory. So fast forward to the 1980s. So Horkheimer's writing this in class terms in the 1930s. By the 1980s, all sorts of other critical theories have developed. There's critical gender theory, critical pedagogy for the study of education. And then in the 1980s, a group of academics, mainly, so one of the co-founders is Kimberly Crenshaw, who's a prominent legal professor. Her and Richard Delgado, Derek Bell are some of the major names. They have an academic conference where they coin the term critical race theory. And basically what they're saying, this is an homage to Horkheimer and the old critical theorists. We're taking the critical theory framework and we're using race as the tool, as the mechanism that we analyze society. And it's claimed to emancipate race, but it's doing it from a very left-wing political perspective.
Okay, so those are the ideological roots, so to speak, of critical race theory. But does it relate to the social justice movements, or just some, because
it is,
it's sort of part of the social justice discourse?
Yeah,
right?
they present themselves as modern social justice theorists. And if you go back to the records, that the accounts of those conferences in the 1980s when they coined the term, I mean, Richard Delgado even gave an interview where he says, this was a gathering of a bunch of Marxists.
Okay.
This is a gathering of a bunch of Marxist academics that were trying to figure out social justice, and by that they mean an upheaval of society to overturn capitalism. So it was explicitly anti-capitalist because they see capitalism as being at odds with social justice, and they want to redistribute. But rather than just strictly being economic redistribution on class lines of a proletarian versus a bourgeois, the traditional Marxist approach, this is saying that race is the dividing line and we need to correct past racial injustices through redistribution.
One of the things that I find really interesting is that people who are white, just by virtue of being white, cannot help but be the oppressor in this way of thinking, of this framework. And so I understand that at these conferences, these initial conferences, where they were even talking with other critical theory experts or legal critical theory experts, the white members of the panels were accused of having done wrong, and
simply because of their race, simply because of their skin color. So it's a direct inversion of what the old civil rights message of not judging people on the color of their skin. Mm-hmm. This is elevating skin color to the forefront, and it's saying so in a very collective way. Mm-hmm. So it's not you're an individual white person, it's you're a member of the white race, the white group, and therefore you are collectively responsible for these wrongs, or collectively tainted and biased by these wrongs of the past. So it's asserting a collective guilt, and even more so than that, it's asserting that skin color is a mechanism by which we can mete out privilege. We can determine who has power. And you asked this question historically. I mean, there have been oppressed people of every race, every creed, color, religion, gender, across history that have suffered horrific indignities. There were white people in the Soviet gulags, white people, Jewish people in the concentration camps. Do we judge them on their skin color and say, well, that they're of a different position of privilege? They face some of the most horrific crimes against humanity in history. So I think just on its face, this is an absurd way of looking at things because it takes the individual suffering away and asserts a collective guilt.
Yeah, and it seems that people who are critical of critical race theory come off as racist or can be labeled as racist. And we are, of course, not denying the fact that people have been discriminated in the past and currently. But is racism systemic? Is it built into our system?
I think racism is institutional. I'd say it's rather institutional rather than systemic. And what that means is there are basic institutions of society that have absorbed racial discrimination. We see this in law. We see this in government policies. We see this in the legacy of things like slavery that was sanctioned by governments. So there's absolutely true that institutional derivatives of racism in the past are still with us. I say this is something we analyze through something like public choice theory, which studies these institutions and asks the question, why does inequality emerge from actions that the government has taken in the past, even if they're nominally on paper saying that race is not a consideration here? So the answer here is yes, there is institutional racism, and it's absolutely something worth studying. But what the critical race theorists do is they attempt to monopolize that conversation. They attempt to assert that only critical race theory is suited to analyze these tools. And they go even further, that there are other competitor anti-discriminatory modes of analysis, such as public choice theory. Well, the critical race theorists say that all other views, all other approaches to this are de facto racist, and therefore they can be discounted and excluded. And that there's even writings I have from Kimberly Crenshaw where she says public choice theory is racist, and we should just write it off entirely. We don't even have to encounter its arguments. We can just dismiss it as racist. And I'm here saying, well, wait, public choice theory is actually a better mode of analysis for discrimination than anything that you're offering, because what you're offering from the critical race theory view is all rooted in ideology.
What would be the kind of policy prescriptions that would come off if we accept this ideology?
Well, that's the thing of critical race theory. So they start very innocuously saying we're against racism. We want to correct past injustices. And that's how they hook people in, because everyone generally agrees with that. Racism's wrong, and we want to correct past injustices. But then they make a leap of logic. And then it says, therefore, we need radical income redistribution. We need to topple capitalism. We need the Green New Deal. We need this whole litany of socialized medicine, of all these policies that aren't really so much connected to race, but they're very much of a far left progressive viewpoint. And they just pivot between the two. And then you say, well, wait a minute, I'm opposed to socialized medicine, and I think capitalism's actually done good for the world. And they say, well, therefore you're a racist. So that's the trick that they play. It's a sleight of hand rhetorically.
It sort of places us in a very awkward position, right? After George Floyd's murder on June 1st of 2020, there were really large protests, not only in the United States, but worldwide. And I mean, there's some quite bizarre outcomes. So universities in Scotland naming buildings after George Floyd and things like that. Right. But there was quite a lot of violence and protests in the United States. So what effect did this have on the U.S. economy and on the political realm?
Well, I think that the whole George Floyd incident has devolved into a political tragedy of enormous proportions. When I first saw the video of George Floyd being killed, being murdered, I was horrified. And I think almost anyone across the political spectrum who saw that video was disgusted. And originally there is an outrage, a justified outrage against what happened. But then it was seized for political reasons by mainly on the far left as a way to advance not justice for George Floyd, but a whole sweeping array of political objectives that are connected to economic redistribution, connected to toppling capitalism, connected to all sorts of crazy things. And if you investigate some of these causes that they did, you mentioned the renaming things in Scotland. They had a commission in Scotland that identified Adam Smith as a bad person, as a wrong person, a candidate for being designated for renaming. Because Adam Smith is associated with the origins of capitalism, and then they've already deemed capitalism as racist, so therefore Adam Smith somehow has to be toppled. And unmentioned in any of this is the fact that Adam Smith was an abolitionist, one of the earliest and foremost abolitionists of his time, wrote lengthy essays condemning slavery. I just lectured in one in my class last night. And there's no connection that was being made here. And you start seeing all these other examples. They'll topple statues of George Washington, and one case they even toppled the statue of Abraham Lincoln, and another of Ulysses S. Grant. These are not people that are seen as pro-slavery, but it's like this random toppling of statues for symbolic reasons, but they ignore the statues of their heroes on the left. Why are no Karl Marx statues toppled? Karl Marx was a vicious racist. Used the N-word, talked about black people as if they were subhuman, talked about Jewish people in very anti-Semitic ways. This is throughout Karl Marx's writings. Why hasn't Karl Marx been canceled? Well, the answer is that they agree with his ideology, not his person.
In Latin America, what we're toppling are Christopher Columbus statues. It's also a worldwide trend, I think, but it's quite bizarre, this sort of a selective history, and rewriting of history, which leads us into the next question I had, because you've authored a book called The 1619 Project, a critique.
Right.
And I think many of our audience might not be familiar with the 1619 Project. So can you tell us a little bit about the project itself and how your book has made a splash?
Yes. So the 1619 Project was a special issue of the New York Times that came out in August of 2019, and it was on the 400th anniversary of the first slave ship arriving in what is now the United States. It was Jamestown, Virginia. Although there was slavery in the New World well before that, the Spanish brought it over, the Portuguese brought it over, but the first ship that arrived in an English colony was in 1619. So what they did is they said, we're going to use this as an occasion to re-examine the history of slavery and its legacy in the United States, which I think, hey, this is a worthwhile endeavor. And I start reading the project. I'm a historian of slavery. I've written dozens of books and works and academic articles on this exact topic, so I'm initially excited. I had even written previous articles for the New York Times on the history of slavery back in 2012, 2013 on the anniversary of the American Civil War. So I'm excited when I read this, and I open it, and I immediately notice that this is no longer a journalistic investigation. It was a political project, and an extremely one-sided political project. And really, it came from 2 to 3 of the main essays there, one by the creator, Nicole Hannah-Jones, another by one of her writers, Matthew Desmond. And what she has in it is, rather than doing a contextualization of slavery historically, it takes 2020 era left-wing politics and tries to weaponize the past as a basis to advocate for income redistribution, socialized healthcare, all the list of goals that they have. And part of this means they're trying to tie capitalism to slavery. They're trying to assert that capitalism is inherently wedded to slavery, and slavery has infused capitalism with brutality today. So all of their modern grievances with capitalism are tied to slavery. Therefore, capitalism needs to be overturned. And it's a really poor historical argument because it neglects the fact that the historical capitalists, people like Adam Smith and his heirs, his successors, were abolitionists. And even more so, you can go back to the 1850s and you find some of the most vocal pro-slavery voices people like Thomas Carlyle and George Fitzhugh. They're fairly obscure today, but at the time they were considered leading pro-slavery voices. They were anti-capitalists. They hated capitalism. Fitzhugh even called himself a socialist. He said slavery perfects socialism. And so this is a complete inversion of the historical record here, also based on all sorts of historical errors. So what my book did is I went through at least the main essays where the problems were, and I documented the errors and wrote a rebuttal to them.
That's great. Yeah, it would sound to me that many of the slave owners might have been rent seekers.
Absolutely.
And mercantilists.
Absolutely. So there's the political philosophy that they adopted as mercantilism.
You need the law to be on your side for such a trade. Yeah.
And you lobby the government to pay for slave patrols. You lobby the government to buy arms to put down slave revolts. And they absolutely did.
And you even analyzed whether this was economically sound, whether slavery was on its way out.
Absolutely.
Just by sheer market pressure.
Right. So, and this was Adam Smith's point, that slavery is in addition to being morally horrendous, it's a vastly inferior form of economic production. Free labor is far better for economic wealth, for generating wealth. And at the time of the middle of the 1800s, when slavery is a dominant political issue, there are several writers that travel to regions where slavery is the main economic system. And the observation they all make is that these places are underdeveloped. Poverty is rampant. Poverty both on the plantation for the slaves themselves, but poverty among non-slave owners. They're excluded economically. There's no industry. There are no major economic enterprises. Everything's stagnant and wedded to land and plantations that are just laying fallow, that are underproductive. So it's an economically moribund system. And yet here's this 1619 Project claiming that this is the essence of capitalism. You look at immigration patterns in the 19th century when people are fleeing Europe, some of the political revolutions there, and fleeing disease like the Irish famine. Where do they resettle? They don't resettle mostly in the places that slavery is prominent. They go to the free parts of the world, free parts of the New World. And they do that for a reason, because that's where the economic activity is.
That's where they'll prosper.
Exactly.
Flourish.
Exactly.
Do you think critical race theory will filter into the language of like popular indigenous movements around the world? And what is the best way to sort of
I think it
combat
absolutely
this ideology?
is. It already is. It's filtering into other areas where you can draw a racial line or an ethnic line or a religious line. And that's the purpose of the critical theory approach, is you use these dividing lines of group characteristics to then enact policies that marginalize individuals. So it's a framework that has been presented in terms of race, or in the original version, the critical theory of class, that could be adapted to religion, race, gender, sexual orientation, you name it, the whole list of any characteristic where someone has been historically oppressed. And that's not denying historical oppression exists. It's saying that this is the only way that they want to look at that oppression, is this group identity. And I think it's unfortunately very right, because you look at the scholarship behind it, it's almost all ideology. It's very low rigor. There's not empirical methods behind it. It's very weak on empirical methods. They often bend the facts. They bend the truth to fit the political story that they want to tell. And when you read it, it comes across as, most of this literature comes across as word games, semantic games. It's a jumble of language using invented terminology, but really no substance behind it. And yet they use that fact as intentional obscuring methods of the language to hide that they're really just pushing politics.
So what's the best way for us to react to this?
Well, I think we take it seriously as an academic enterprise, knowing that it is abundant and it's something that's certainly become trendy. But at the same time, we need to challenge it on its robustness, on its rigor. We need to offer alternative explanations to combat discrimination. We need to turn to economic theory. We need to turn to classical political theory of rights, a rights-based political theory. And this is something that goes back to the colorblindness argument. If rights are asserted and distinct and accessible to everyone, regardless of their race, religion, color, creed, gender, that's a uniform, neutral proposition. Some of the public choice theorists, so James M. Buchanan and William H. Hutt, basically wrote that we need a constitutional generality norm that says discrimination is off limits. It binds the government to non-discrimination. It says lawmakers cannot engage in any action that discriminates against one group or in favor of another group. And this includes everything from laws that are segregationist, prejudicial, to also not giving favors out, not giving privileged subsidies out. So it's a strict neutrality, strict non-discrimination at the constitutional level. And both of them say that this is a norm that should be strived for by countries. And if a law passes that engages in discrimination, it is by default unconstitutional. So I consider that a much more robust approach than saying we've purported to define collective identities and therefore we need to privilege certain identities over others at the expense of individuals.
And it breeds peace instead of conflict, which I think is one of the effects that we're experiencing now is conflict and resentment and hatefulness, and it's a very disagreeable environment.
Yeah, and that's critical race theory's track record. I mean, this thing is the supposed solution to racial discrimination. Everywhere that this is pushed into the intellectual sphere, it just breeds conflict. I mean, it almost like foments division and hatred. And that's similar to almost all Marxist ideologies. They're all about exploiting the conflict to get a political end because they've decided that their side of the conflict, the collision, the dialectic between what they think is the good and the bad happens to be the mechanism that drives society. And when you foment that, it's not a shocking result that violence usually follows.
Well, thank you so much. We have learned a lot from this conversation. Is there anything you would like to add just before we close?
I'd say, the one thing I would urge everyone that encounters critical race theory in these subjects is to take prejudice and discrimination seriously. There is a risk on the other side to kind of say, oh, that's in the past, push it behind us. But we actually need to study the past, and we need to study the past with nuance to understand why discriminatory institutions emerged and what we can do to prevent them from emerging again in the future.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Phil, and thank you for granting us this interview. For more information regarding Instituto Fe y Libertad, its work, activities, and what we discussed in this episode, you can visit www.feylibertad.org. Our site's on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, and our YouTube channel.
All right.
So thank you very much for joining us. Until next time.
Excellent.